Okay, so just to kind of get started, Dr. Bassina and I are going to kind of go back and forth and present on different slides. So hopefully you'll get the benefit of both. So some food and then lots of information on insulin and bolusing and how to kind of do all that. So we really appreciate you coming to our talk on factoring protein, carbs, and fats. So really thinking about how to bolus for those macronutrients that we all, of course, want to eat. So we really wanted to take this opportunity to thank the people who really asked, well, Dr. Bassina, of course, first, and then Dr. Bassina invited me to speak as well, the Stanford Health Library, JDRF, the Stanford Diabetes Research Center, Stanford Healthcare for Diabetes Care Program. And so we just want to thank you for allowing us to speak today. And then, of course, definitely thanking you for joining us. So our plan for today is to hopefully make it as interactive as possible, given that we are on Zoom, but we're going to try to do that. So we have some polls to kind of pick your brain and see where you're at. We're going to talk about bolusing for carbohydrates, fiber, how to kind of add fiber in. I know that's a really hot topic. A lot of people have questions around it. Fat, protein. We're going to talk a lot about what to do with insulin pumps, as well as what to do for multiple daily injections, or MDIs. And then we're going to look at some CGM data together and kind of problem solve and see what happened. So here is Dr. Bassina.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our first webinar.
Oh, I think you're muted, Dr. Bassina.
Oh, no, I'm not. It doesn't show that I'm muted. Can you try to unmute me or? Yeah, so everyone I think heard me. Yeah, thank you. All right, great. So thank you again for joining us today. And we again, as Leah said, we really appreciate everyone's help and JDRF's help and Stanford Diabetes Research Center help to organize this forum. So we are going to go over this agenda that Leah just told us. So how to make, so we all, and most of you probably wear continuous glucose monitoring device. So we just usually you see on those devices, you see tons of numbers changing every 5 minutes. You get 288 readings per day. You get over 2,000 readings per week, and you get over 8,000 readings per month. Sorry, Leah's saying that she cannot hear me, but I think everyone can hear me. I can see it in the chat. So I'll just, so I don't know why she cannot hear me. So how to make sense of this data and how not to kind of drown in this data, and how to use it for your own health. Can we advance the slide? Then Leah cannot hear me. Okay, great. So there are challenges in the insulin therapy for various reasons. I know you all try to be perfectionists and do really amazing job with controlling your blood sugars, but don't be very hard on yourself, because it's not, you don't have to be perfect, and it doesn't have to be an ideal number, because there are many challenges in this insulin therapy. So what are our goals for the insulin therapy? So one is we want to suppress the beta cell making the glucagon, because when there is no insulin produced in the beta cells, it cannot suppress the glucagon in the neighbor alpha cells in the pancreas. So therefore the glucagon increases the production of the glucose by the liver. So that's a process that we unfortunately cannot stop. We are trying to give insulin to stop that, but if we give too much insulin to overcome that, then the blood sugars get low. So the insulin needs to work fast to match carbohydrate absorption, but unfortunately carbs are always faster than the insulin, and we're not able to match it until we get faster insulin available in the market. So other challenges for the insulin therapy is that normally when pancreas produces insulin, liver takes most of it. And goes, so when this insulin is secreted, it goes straight to the liver and suppresses liver to produce extra insulin, which we're not able to do with just subcutaneously injecting the insulin, because it doesn't go straight to the liver and we are injecting it in the subcutaneous tissue. So the insulin normally in this portal circulation, and the circulation that goes straight to the liver, is way higher than in systemic circulation. And that again helps with liver not produce extra glucose, which again is missing when insulin is not coming from the pancreas, but gets injected. So therefore, if we give too much insulin, we are suppressing the liver too much, and we're not able to respond to low blood sugars and to produce enough glucose. Therefore, we can only suppress it that much to be in the safe zone. Plus, if we get the high insulin levels when the food is already absorbed and we're suppressing liver at that time, then we're not able to respond to low blood sugars. So all those challenges are not allowing us to keep really, really tight control. A lot of patients will say how can we keep blood sugars at normal level? So again, because of those challenges, you're all doing an amazing job, but it's just not possible to get them completely normal. Next. All right, so one key of the insulin administration, which is the most important one to think about, because no matter how great our devices are, no matter how wonderful the insulins are, we need to be able to get good absorption from the injection sites. So if the injection sites are not working well, or if there's a scar tissue formation, then no matter how, again, wonderful our closed loop system is, we're still not going to be able to achieve great results. So the postprandial glucose spike usually spikes are inversely related to the rate of the insulin absorption. So from the abdomen, usually absorption is the fastest, again, assuming that it doesn't go into the scar tissue. And there were studies looking at the blood sugar post-meal and looking at which site gave us the lower postprandial spike. So from the abdomen, it was 30 to 50 milligram per deciliter lower than if you inject the insulin into the leg. So it's fastest in the abdomen, a little slower in the arm, and the slowest in the leg unless you inject and you go for a run, right? So it's arm is better than the leg, but the abdomen is the fastest absorption. So again, if you're choosing for something that is fast acting carbohydrates, you may want to choose the side that's absorbed faster. If you are going to be injecting something for the high protein and high fat meal, you may think about, oh, I'm going to sit down and watching the movie. We're all locked down now in our houses, so I'm not going to go anywhere. And I'm just going to inject in the leg and eat slowly watching the movie. So again, think about that when you're injecting the insulin. The next one. So there's a very important to time the insulin. So it's better to take it before a meal, as you all know, and you can see on the graphs here, if the red graph gives you if you're injecting before the meal, so that's the red graph. So you can see that the spike is not as pronounced as if you inject right at the meal, at the start of the meal, or if you do it right after the meal. So you can see the spike is more significant. So again, it's important to get and to inject insulin before the meal. So Ideally, it should be 15-20 minutes before the meal, although there are some tricks about how to inject it in individuals who are on the closed loop systems, and we can touch base on that. But in general, it's with the injections and with the non-closed loop pumps, it would be 15-20 minutes before the meal. So routine boluses before the meals have been associated with the lower hemoglobin A1C level, again, because of that reduction of the postprandial spikes. Timing of the meals also associated with increased risk of low blood sugars if the timing is wrong. Because when the insulin peaks and when the food already gone, that's you're at risk for getting low blood sugars. So if we're consuming quite high amount of the fat with that meal, and Lee is going to talk about that later, so the actual absorption and the more of the high blood sugars will be 5 hours or later after that meal. And therefore, for that meal, we might need to use different boluses comparing to if we're going to Jamba Juice and having a smoothie. If we're getting the protein, especially heavy meat protein, that also absorbed over hours, could be 6 to 8 hours or 4 to 6 hours, depending on the protein, and that will raise blood sugar later on. Okay, the next. So to add more complexity to that, so it's not just the sites, it's not just the absorption, it's not just the timing of insulin, but to all of that, add the hormones and add how glucose itself is affecting the absorption. So if we talk about those postprandial exertion, normally the system, our body, the way it's designed, that it's a brake mechanism. So our stomach works as a brake. So if we eat and we have plenty of sugar in the stomach absorption slows down. It slows down because the insulin is produced from the pancreas, but not only insulin. Then there's another hormone that's made in the pancreatic beta cell that's called amylin. So this hormone tells the body or tells the stomach, the sugar is high, slow down. Don't send that much sugar to the blood. So that's normally what should be happening if the glucose level rise, the insulin and the amylin produced and the stomach absorption gets slower. On the other hand, glucose by itself affecting the gastric emptying. So go figure how you set it all up and how you figure out how much insulin to take for all of this. So again, increase in glucose, increases in insulin and amylin, the two hormones that are produced by the pancreas. It decreases the other hormone that's called ghrelin that is produced in the stomach. So that all slows down the gastric emptying and all reduces glucose appearance in the blood. So this is the protective mechanism that body has. So what happens in type 1 diabetes? There is reduced insulin, there is reduced amylin production, right? So the glucose the food empties faster from the stomach, and the appearance of the glucose in the blood is faster than normally we should expect, because so this protective mechanism is also impaired. Next. So we're going to do specific examples, so which Leah will go over. You're muted.
Oh wait, so I'm gonna launch a poll, and so I want you all to answer. So if this is the example, here's our scenario. So we have a person named Lucy. She's gonna go eat this meal that she's prepared. Her blood sugar pre-meal is 220. Before this lunch that she's planning on eating. So I want you to guess how much insulin, if you were Lucy, how much insulin would you give? So you have her carb to insulin ratio that her endocrinologist, like Dr. Bassina, has given her, the 1 to 2, so or 1 to 12, sorry. So for every 12 grams of carbs, she gets 1 unit of insulin. You have her correction factor based on her blood sugar. So I'm gonna launch this poll, and I want you all to guess. So I'll give you maybe like 20 more seconds, and then I will end the poll. we have a little under 50% of the people have polled. Oh, a lot more. Everyone had to do the math. Okay, great. I'm going to end the polling. Okay, so I'm going to share these results. So when you all were guessing, you can kind of compare and see where you compared to other people. So the majority thought you would 4 or 5 units to give for this plate of food. 9% of you thought 6 units, 16% thought 7, 11% thought 8, and then 2% thought 9 units. So by the end of our presentation, we're going to re-bring up Lucy, and we're going to kind of see if your answers have changed by the end of our presentation. Okay, so when we think about what is food made of, the things that give energy to our bodies are called macronutrients. So macronutrients are our fats, our protein, and our carbohydrates. There's a standard amount of calories per gram. It's standard. We know it doesn't change. So fat has 9 calories per gram. Protein has 4 calories per gram, and carbohydrates have 4 calories per gram. I didn't put it on the slide, but alcohol actually has 7 calories per gram, in case you're wondering. Something that can sometimes be helpful is just knowing the conversion. So there are 3 teaspoons in 1 tablespoon, and that might help you later on in some of our examples. So when we think about carbohydrate counting, I'm sure you all are very familiar with this, but we really want to identify what foods have carbohydrates. And so I just had a brief slide on foods that contain carbohydrates. So really those starches, but under the umbrella of carbohydrates, we have fiber, which is a carbohydrate, we have sugar, which is a carbohydrate, and then we just have starches. So it's really important to know that all these things make up carbohydrates. So things like bread, pasta, rice, corn, peas, and potatoes are starchy vegetables. Dairy has carbohydrate in the form of lactose. So there's a lot of different kinds of carbohydrates in the foods that we have. One of the big questions that Dr. Basina and I both get a lot, I think, is fiber. So the question is, do I count fiber? What is fiber? What does fiber mean? So fiber is really the roughage or the bulk that makes up food. So if you look at this slide, if you think about an apple is a perfect example because the outside of the apple has this fiber called insoluble fiber. I think about it like scrubber brushes in your colon. It's not digested. It helps keep your colon healthy, helps you kind of just to overall be healthy, helps lower cholesterol. The inner part of the apple has soluble fiber. Soluble also kind of adds bulk to your stool, is not very much digested, although you have some gut bacteria that can ferment and digest some of the soluble fiber. So there's 2 types, and I think apples are a really good example. So talking about fiber sort of leads us into this concept of net carbs. So thinking about looking at net carbs, I have one more poll for you. So I'm going to launch this poll, and my question for you is, do you use net carbs? So I'll give you maybe like 15 seconds because it's probably an easy answer. You don't have to do math for this one, and we'll see what everyone thinks. Wow, this one, everyone's a lot faster on this poll. Okay. So we have 78% of you have voted, so I'm going to share these results. And so when we look at these results, I think you all can see it. So do you use net carbs? 61% of you said yes, and 39% of you said no. So that's definitely really interesting to know, and we can kind of know that for our presentation. So when we think about net carbs, it's always good to kind of go back to the history. So who created this terminology? Did Dr. Bassina create this terminology, or did I? It came as more of a food marketing term. So really, people realized that consumers wanted to have low carbohydrate options or low carb options with the whole fad of the Atkins diet and different diets like that. And so the food companies, food marketers came up with this concept called net carbs, because then they could give this product and they could say, hey, it says total carbs, because we have to put total carbs on here, but not all of them are absorbable, so we're going to call them net carbs. So like, for example, with this Fiber One bar, the total carbohydrates are 27. But then there's like 18 net carbs, so if you subtract the fiber, so what's not broken down. I also put on this Fiber One bar, which is an example, because Fiber One bars I would consider a supplemented fiber food. And by supplemented fiber food, I mean, if you walk out in Mother Nature and say you go to someone's farm, for example, and you're walking out to the farm and you're looking at all the beautiful produce that's growing, you're not going to walk over to a plant and pull out a Fiber One bar because it's processed, right? It's something that food companies have devised, and they've added a lot of extra fiber. So if you look at the ingredients, the first ingredient is actually hickory root extract, which is basically like a sort of a soluble fiber. So the first ingredient, they're basically adding like a benefiber equivalent to this Fiber One bar, which is really amplifying the amount of fiber that they have in this bar. So another thing to really go over are things that are sugar-free. So thinking about sugar alcohol, this is another thing that ends up being within net carbs. So here's an example of just an Atkins bar that I found. And if you look in bold, the largest thing on the label, it says 3 grams of Atkins net carbs, going definitely with their branding. And if you look at this, so when we look at labels, the first thing we always want to look at is serving size. Right, so this tells us how much all of the nutrition facts are for. So sometimes they get tricky and they say things like 2 servings per container. Like if you think about maybe Reese's peanut butter cups and you plan to eat both of them, but it says 2 servings per container, and so you carb count as 1 whole container, but really you have to multiply by 2. So they get tricky. Here, if you look at total carbohydrates, there's 20 grams of total carbohydrates, 7 grams of dietary fiber. And then if you look down here, sugar alcohols, which are 10 grams. So really thinking about what does a sugar alcohol mean? It's normally something that has like an all. So if you look in this nutrition fact, the first ingredient is peanuts. The second one is maltol. So sorbitol, erythritol, so all those alls are basically more sugar alcohols. They add an OH on, and so it makes it so your body tastes them as sweet, but doesn't absorb all of that as a carb. So the food companies like to say that sugar alcohols are 100% not absorbed. But what we know is, in general, when people digest these sugar alcohols, the body breaks them apart, and about 50% gets absorbed and converted to glucose in the bloodstream, and 50% end up in your digestive tract.
Leah, there is a question in the chat.
I can't hear you, Dr. Bassina.
Can you hear me?
Is Dr. Bassina talking to me?
Yes, I go up. So there is a question in the chat. Sorry for all those technical issues.
Yeah, what's the question?
Okay, here. Okay. So there's a question, do we deduct all the fiber from the total carbs or 50% of the fiber?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. So I have another slide on that really goes over more of the recommendations. So I will get to that in like one more slide. But that's a good question. Okay, So when we're thinking about net carbs, for example, we really want to think about subtracting half of the net carbs. So the sugar alcohols. Sugar alcohols are different from fiber. So I think that's like the main point to make. Sugar alcohols are different composition than fiber. So when we thought about here, the fiber 1 bar, we'll talk more about how to account for fiber. But when we're talking about sugar alcohols, this is where we tend to absorb 50% of them. And that 50%, I would say for here, you want to subtract 50% of those sugar alcohols. In this example, you can subtract the fiber because it's greater than 5 and it's a supplemented food. So when we think about foods that Mother Nature doesn't make, like fiber 1 bars and Atkins bars, I would say it is more important to subtract the fiber because they're basically man-made or woman-made created foods that have excess fiber than what Mother Nature would have made. So for example, if you look at total carbohydrates 20, you can subtract the fiber because this is an Atkins bar, a supplement fiber bar. You get 13, and then you can either, in Atkins, they subtracted all 10 of those sugar alcohols, but for this, the purpose of T1D, I would say you should subtract half. So actually, I would dose for 8 grams of this Atkins caramel chocolate nut bar instead of for 3. So really what we're thinking about for whole foods, you normally don't have to really focus on subtracting fiber. That's what we really recommend in our clinic because it gets a little bit challenging if you're always figuring fiber amount and always subtracting. We've noticed that people's blood sugars tend to just be higher overall. But there are things like lentils that are very high in fiber. So if we, normally when we teach carbohydrate counting, lentils, half a cup of lentils is 15 grams of carb. But if you look at the total grams of lentils, it's 30, 31 because we've already subtracted the fiber. Here's another example of an apple. So if we have a 3-inch apple, like a medium-sized apple, there are 25 grams of carbs. 4 of them are fiber, 19 of them are sugar. I would say that I would recommend dosing for all 25 grams. Does that answer your question? So if we were to look at this label, so this Cheerios label, for 1 cup, there is 22 grams of carbohydrate, 3 grams of fiber. So I have one more poll that I'm going to ask. So are you all ready? I'm going to launch the poll. So the question is, would you subtract for the fiber if you ate the Cheerios? 1 cup. Okay, I'll give you just a couple more seconds and then I'll end the poll. Okay, that one I think we had 82%, which is a B, so that's good. So would you subtract the fiber? 28 of you said, oh, sorry. Let me share the results. 28% of you said yes, and 72% of you said no. So I would definitely agree with the majority. For the Cheerio example, I would not subtract the fiber for 2 reasons. 1, the fiber is lower than 5. And 2, you definitely still need those 3 grams of carb because cereals tend to really spike blood sugars. So for this cereal and for most cereals in general, I would not subtract the fiber. With all these guidelines, I will definitely say everybody's body is a little bit different and everybody's management is a little bit different, however they choose to kind of live their life. And so it's always an experiment. Say you've always subtracted fiber from your Cheerios, maybe try one day not subtracting the fiber and see if it gives you a little bit extra insulin and if that makes a difference. So these are all could be experiments. It doesn't have to be like fast and hard rules. There's not the rules, but just experiments. So here's an example of red lentils. So lentils are very high naturally in fiber, so really high in soluble fiber. And so though this would be an example where you could subtract the fiber. But when we really go over carbohydrate counting, our recommendations, we already teach that the subtracted fiber grams. When we say half a cup of cooked lentils is 15 grams of carbohydrate. So I have another poll. So my question to you all is, have you found that cooked carbs raise your blood sugar higher faster or not? Yes or no? Okay, so I'm going to stop this poll. So the majority of you, 56%, said that yes, so cooked carbohydrates do raise your blood sugar higher faster, and then 44% of you said no. So it's actually kind of close. I would say that when we're thinking about things, for example, like lentils, as you see in this, the top has lentils as dal, which is kind of like a soupy, really cooked down form of lentils, and the left side has more whole lentils. So oftentimes we do see foods that are more cooked tend to be raise your blood sugar a little higher faster. There's a question about different types of lentils.
Yeah, so there's a question about, do red lentils have less fiber than tan lentils? Isn't the outer layer removed from red lentils?
Do you mind reading the question? It's harder for me to see it in the screen that I'm in.
Yeah, can you hear me, Leah? Do red lentils have less fiber than tan lentils?
Oh, sorry, can you read it one more time?
Do red lentils have less fiber than tan lentils? Isn't the outer layer removed from red lentils?
Yeah, so red lentils, or the kind of more orange looking lentils that have the outer part removed, have less fiber, less insoluble fiber, and more soluble fiber. Yeah, that's a good point too. So kind of looking at, I hope that answers the question. Does that answer your question? So looking kind of at this example, so the dal that's more soupy and more cooked down, those lentils really are, they're more open and their starches are more available, so they tend to raise our blood sugar higher faster, as well as foods that are really warm versus colder foods, because they're more available in a faster way to our body for the absorption. So thinking about different foods, for example, like protein foods, so going through our macronutrients, amino acids are the building blocks of protein. So when we think about protein foods, normally like meat or fish, and when we're talking about things like protein, carbs, and fats, it's really hard to take all of the macronutrients and break them apart. Oftentimes we do not eat a meal that's solely carbohydrates, or a meal that's only protein, or a meal that's only fat. Normally we kind of mix them, and that's what we're really going to talk about today. We have some carb sources of proteins like beans, lentils, quinoa, or amaranth are all complete proteins that are also carbohydrates as well. So the body can also utilize amino acids, or the building blocks of protein, to convert and make glucose in the body if it needs to, and if there's a lot. So that's why we're going to talk a little bit about counting protein as well. And then our last macronutrient that we're going to talk about is fat. And so in general, our recommendation is around 20 to 35% of our daily calories, and then a smaller proportion of saturated fat is recommended. So about 10% or less of daily calories. And then saturated fats, where did those come from? They come more from animal sources, they come from dairy, and plant sources like coconut fat. And then unsaturated fats like oils, nuts, and seeds, we want more of that. So thinking about that. Here's some examples of fat foods that are nutrition facts, like coconut oil versus olive oil versus butter. All 1 tablespoon. So if you think about and you look, they don't have any carbohydrates and they don't have any protein. They're just solely more fat-based. Some are oils and some are solid. Here's an example of a food that I would consider, like if you're adding it to your meals, to maybe consider counting and accounting for the fat. So avocados. So looking at a medium avocado, it's around like 220 calories, and it's around 20 grams of fat for the avocado. When we think about fat foods, avocados are definitely healthy options, very healthy choices. They have a lot of monounsaturated fats, so fats that are really good for our heart and our overall body. So avocados are a great choice. But with our blood sugar, we may need to still factor and count them as we're dosing for insulin.
All right, so is it the real art, or is it science, or is it more individualized? Which is, there's no great answer to this. This is unfortunately not a science. I would say this is more of the art. And again, there's so many factors that are encountered when there are different foods, the temperature of the food, the absorption, as we, other factors that we mentioned. So the general recommendations are that for every high-fat meal that has more than 30 to 40 grams of fat, and that would be any type of fat, then consider increasing your insulin dose by 30 to 35%. And for those meals, use combo or extended or dual way bolus, depending on which pump you have. The same thing, you would be applying for the closed loop pumps, some of them. For example, Medtronic, whoever is on 670G Medtronic pump is not able to do the extended boluses. So the boluses would need to be split in 2 boluses. But with Control-IQ Tandem, you can still use extended boluses. And the pumps that are not used with the algorithm, you can use the extended boluses. If you're on injections for the insulin, then take 30 to 35% of the pre-meal dose, 1 hour. So if you calculate total dose, take about 1/3 of that 1 hour after the meal. So that would cover the second portion of the absorption of that particular meal. Next slide, please. All right.
Okay. So thinking about where do we find carbohydrates, fat, and protein grams? So we can always look at nutrition fact labels. So if we have a food that has a nutrition fact label, we can definitely always look at that. Something to note is whenever we talk about carbohydrate counting, we always talk about the food as it's prepared when you're going to eat it. So for example, pasta or rice, we don't talk about dry rice when we give out materials, we talk about cooked rice. But when you look at food products like pasta or rice, the food labels normally have them noted for uncooked. So that's a really important thing to distinct and think about when you're carb counting with nutrition fact labels. You can also use things like MyFitnessPal app, Lose It, or Fitbit or Calorie King. I would say that specifically for MyFitnessPal, anyone can add foods. So you really want to think about looking at ones that have that green check mark. So foods that are more verified, because people can kind of add different amounts of carbs and it's not verified that it's always correct. You can also import your own recipes into these apps, like specifically MyFitnessPal. You can go online, find your recipe, and then import it in for yourself. And then also you can think about kind of Googling and looking at nutrient databases on your own time if there's a food that you eat often to see. Or if it's a food related to a restaurant, like In-N-Out, for example, has all their nutrition facts online that you can also look at. So thinking about how would you dose for this meal? So if you go to a steakhouse or something like that, I have another poll question for you. And so this poll question says, have you ever eaten a meal like this, a steak, veggies, and mashed potatoes out at a restaurant or at home, and noticed that your blood sugars were higher than you expected? So one more poll. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. So overwhelmingly, 81% of you said yes. So maybe you ate this meal and it was steak, more veggies, non-starchy veggies, and just a little bit of mashed potatoes, and maybe you even ate less than what they offered you for your mashed potatoes, and maybe 3 or 4 hours later, your blood sugars were in the 200s after you dosed for the carbs in the mashed potatoes, and you were surprised. So this is something that we definitely want to talk about as well. Okay, so think about how are you going to dose for this meal. So thinking about your grams of carbohydrates. So on this plate, there's about half a cup of mashed potatoes, around 30 grams of carbohydrates. Balsamic glaze on the steak, 2 tablespoons, about 6 grams of carbohydrates. So the total on this plate is 36 carbs. So thinking if we go back to Lucy, for our example, she's on a 1 to 12, that would be 3 units of insulin for this plate. But if Lucy gave 3 units of insulin, she probably would end up being high later, maybe like 3 or 4 hours later. How much grams of fat? So in the mashed potatoes, there's butter, butter on the veggies. If you can look at the veggies closely, they're glistening, and that's not just from the beautiful veggies, that's from oil. Oftentimes restaurants add a lot of fat to even vegetables. Steak, so at restaurants, oftentimes they'll sear the steak and then they'll add butter on top of it to help keep it really extra tender and juicy. So that might be why steaks at restaurants sometimes taste more flavorful than steaks at home if we don't do that. And then there's also fat from this fillet. So about 38 grams of fat and then 22 grams of protein. So looking at this plate, it's almost 40 grams of fat. And like Dr. Bassina had mentioned prior, we can add 30% of our on top of our insulin dose for this meal. So instead of just counting the 36 grams of carb, which gave us 3 units of insulin, we can add 30% of insulin to help cover this meal. And like Dr. Bassina had mentioned, we don't want to just give this that extra insulin right up front. You want to extend that bolus and give maybe 50% now, 50% in 2 hours. Because fats and proteins don't raise our blood sugar the same way that carbohydrates do. If we all sat here and ate a big bowl of watermelon, for example, our blood sugars would start rising right away, right? But if we ate this meal, this steak meal, and say we're wearing our CGM, continuous glucose monitors, we would eat the meal and our blood sugars may not start rising right away. It maybe will take a little bit of time. And so foods like this with more fats and proteins digest differently, which we'll talk about even more later.
Leah?
Things to be aware of. So when you're starting to experiment and count, Dr. Bassina, do you have something?
So there was a quick question and a great question in the chat. So if the carbs differ from cooked and uncooked meals, how much more carbs should we account for when meal is cooked?
Sorry, what was that question?
So if the carbs are different from cooked and non-cooked foods, when you eat the cooked one, how much more carbs do you eat comparing to what's on the package?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, so what we would do is instead of, So the food doesn't gain carbohydrates. When we count carbs, we just count them more as cooked foods. So say we were to have 1 cup of pasta versus having 2 ounces of dry pasta or 1 cup cooked pasta. So we would just count it more like the 1 cup cooked pasta, about 45 grams of carbohydrates. So cooking the pasta doesn't add carbohydrates, it just adds volume. Does that make sense? Do you think that's answering the question? Okay. So also more things to be aware of. So when you start counting more fats and more proteins, it's also really important to note that since those foods don't digest the same as when you just account for carbohydrates, you have a risk for hypoglycemia or low blood sugars after a couple hours. So that's really why we recommend extending the bolus, and research supports this 50% up front and then 50% over maybe extending it for 2 hours, for example. Because that really helps to mitigate some of those low blood sugars, because people will give insulin right away and maybe their blood sugars will go higher and then start coming down if they do the extended, but if they don't, they'll see it flat and then see it start rising maybe around 2 hours, because now their body is digesting more and they're having more of that rise from the fat and the protein. So that's why we recommend extending. So here's another kind of example. So would you count the fat in this cauliflower pizza? So thinking about that, oh, I can see the chat box now. Someone had asked, how did you decide to add the 30% of the fat and the protein in the steak meal? So going back to Dr. Basina's slide, so this is how we decided. So per Dr. Basina's slide, and it was actually a new study that came out in Diabetes Care this year, they really proved that greater than 30 to 40 grams of fat was considered a high fat meal and could use extra insulin. So like Dr. Basina had mentioned, so if you have a high fat meal, you can add 30 to 35% more insulin to cover the fat and the protein. The important thing to note is it has to be extended over that 2 to 3 hours. The research actually did 2 hours. So that's why we said, for this example, we're basically at 30 grams or 40 grams of fat. So that's why we would add that additional 30% to cover for the fat and the protein in this meal. Okay, so would you count the fat in this cauliflower pizza? So if you look at this cauliflower pizza, a serving size is 1/3 of the pizza. And when you go down and you see 1/3, there is 12 grams of fat, 29 grams of carbohydrate in this cauliflower pizza. It actually probably has a lot of like rice flour or wheat flour, not that much cauliflower. So if you do 1/3 of the pizza, would you count for the fat in the pizza? So I would argue no, because it's less than that 30 to 40 grams of fat, which is considered a higher fat meal. But if you were to decide you were very hungry and you wanted to eat the entire pizza, 36 grams of total fat, that would be an instance in which you could factor that 30% extra. So you always want to think about what your serving is and what you plan to eat, because I definitely know that a lot of people may not just want 1/3 of the pizza. It might not be filling. You may want more, or you may want like 1/6 of the pizza. So you're going to have 6 grams of fat, not 12. So thinking about how would you count this? So this is an avocado toast. So it's a 15-gram carb toast with 2 thick slices of avocado. So with this 1/4 of an avocado, or even 1/6, it's only about 5 grams of fat. And so if you, I would say you would not account for fat. you wouldn't add 30% for this because it's not high enough in fat to add. Because we don't also want people to leave the presentation and get super excited to add fat grams and 30% for high fat meals and start adding them to meals we would not consider as high fat, because then you'll have low blood sugars. If you were to add maybe cheese, like cheddar cheese, 1 or 2 slices to this little avocado toast, or if you were to add a fried egg with butter, then you could consider maybe adding in 30% for the fat, because that would make that a higher fat breakfast. So here's another example. Would you count fat and protein in this meal? So 4 different tacos. So I would recommend thinking about counting the fat grams for this, because if you look at all the cheese and the sauce and the mayonnaise and the fried shrimp and the fried chicken pieces, so that's adding a lot of fat. And then here's another kind of example of a meal. So it has chicken katsu, fried rice, fried noodles, steak with sauce. So this is another meal that's getting higher fat that I would consider counting. So when you're trying to experiment with counting with higher fat foods, think about, does my food have cheese or high fat dairy, creams, butters, things like that? Am I eating like a prime rib? So when I look and I'm eating maybe a steak, or I'm having chicken with skin on, is there a lot of extra fat? Am I having things like fried shrimp, like with the tacos, or their sauces with mayonnaise? Or am I eating a lot of nuts with this meal, or avocado oil? I would say if it's prepared in a restaurant, you probably do want to consider that at least 1 tablespoon or 14 grams of fat was added to that food without you planning on it. So thinking about kind of adding for fat and protein for this. So this is a meal that has tri-tip and avocado, and the carbohydrates. So thinking about kind of this meal, if we tally the fat, 10 plus 10 is 20 grams of fat. And then the grams of protein is 23 or less. So you could consider it because it does have 20 grams of fat, but this is kind of a meal that I would be more hesitant to add protein and fat to, because it's not as high fat unless you got it out at a restaurant and you felt like the rice was fried or something like that, adding more fat, but you could experiment with that. Some key foods to kind of think about that make things higher fat. I have this picture here that gives examples, but definitely things like cheesy, creamed, fried, foods that glisten because they have extra oil. Those are things you want to consider. And then just thinking about different insulin, so really fast acting insulin, like inhalable insulin that works really right away, versus most of our insulins that we have in our pump really take around 30 minutes to work. And that's why Dr. Bassina was saying maybe bolusing up to 30 minutes earlier, because that food, like if we were all eat a bowl of rice, or right now eat a couple peaches because they're in season, our bodies are going to start spiking blood sugar very fast, like maybe within 5-10 minutes. And so we really want to give that injected insulin or pump insulin time to really work. So this comes to a concept called pre-bolusing, maybe 15 to 30 minutes before you eat. So foods that are fruit, rice, pasta, bread, flour-based foods, sweets, really thinking about pre-bolusing with those foods, because when you're injecting insulin or giving insulin from your pump, that insulin is slower. So think about if you had a race, so your insulin is kind of like the tortoise and the food is like the hare. So the hare or the food is running and it's getting into your bloodstream really fast, but the insulin is kind of lagging and it's moseying forward, but it's not running as fast as the fruit, the rice, the pasta, those faster foods. Another thing for pre-bolusing to consider is your current blood sugar and your CGM arrows, continuous glucose monitor arrows. For example, if your current blood sugar is 72, and you're planning on eating some pasta, I would say in that instance, you don't want to pre-bolus 30 minutes because you're already really more in a low situation. But if you were to think, say your blood sugar is maybe 200 and you have a straight arrow, that might be a really good time to think about giving your insulin 30 or 40 minutes ahead of time, help correct that low, and then the insulin will be there when the food gets there. So here's another slide. So this gives a good example if you kind of look through at that spike around 7:30. So when you eat foods like rice or pasta or fruit or smoothies, that's when you get those really sharp upward trends. So this would be a really good example on a time when this person could pre-bolus for that meal to flatten out that curve. So Dr. Basina.
I am trying to answer the question in the chat, which is great. Question, would you pre-bolus for dark chocolate? So what I'm answering is that it depends on your blood sugar, because it depends on the chocolate. Because some dark chocolates have lower amount of carbohydrates, so I would still look at the label, and some are with almonds and some are with different dry fruits. So it depends on what's inside, but also depends on what your current blood sugar is. So if your current blood sugar is on the high side, then yes, definitely pre-bolus, because you will see the rise fairly quickly after you ingest this chocolate. But if your blood sugar is 90, so then don't pre-bolus, then start eating the chocolate and then bolus for it. So consider those effects on the actual blood sugar before you start eating. So for the typical carb digestion, so those are approximation times when you would expect how long will it take for those carbs to be absorbed. For the juice, it would be really quick, within 5 to 20 minutes. So again, the pre-bolusing for this is very important. For fruits, the same thing, or fruit salad or vegetable salad, if there is the starchy vegetables in the salad. The same thing for the fruits. For the vegetables, because of the fiber, so it takes longer for the vegetables to get absorbed. And for the potatoes and yams that have fiber, and also if you eat it with the skin, that will take a little longer. So for the oats, I know that's a popular breakfast, and a lot of you probably will see the spike after the breakfast. When you eat those oats. So oats have fairly high carb content, and you will spike within 1.5 hours after that oatmeal. But then blood sugar after that will come down, because the fiber amount is still relatively small, unless you have the oatmeal that you have to really boil and cook for a prolonged period of time for it to be able to be chewable. For the proteins, takes a longer time to get absorbed. And if you look down here, so for beef, lamb, and cheese, so it does take longer time for those to get absorbed. So if you have those for dinner, and if you're perfect before going to sleep, then you can actually see that rise after the food starts getting absorbing, especially when you're lying down at night. And that's when you see the numbers will start spiking. It will stay high for some period of time. Okay. So other things to consider is the how long bolus will lower the blood sugar. So this would be the insulin action, or what is the insulin action? So what we program in the pump, what the time of the insulin action, duration of insulin action, that determines of how much bolus on board the pump calculates, right? So if we program short insulin action on in the pump, that means that the bolus on board will be lower, and you're at a high risk of the insulin stacking, right? So the actual the kinetics of the insulin is that the half-life of the insulin is anywhere from 4 to 6 hours. If any of you remember the old pumps when we used, so those old pumps, the Medtronic pumps, there was a prefixed duration of insulin time as 6 hours, and then it was 5 hours, so we could not change it. In a current pump, you can change it. But what we hear a lot from the patient is that my insulin does not last for 4 hours. My insulin lasts only for 3 hours or 2 hours. So this is so we always try to explain that this is not your insulin last different time. It's just that your carb ratio need to be adjusted, because whatever you are correcting after a meal, that sort of patching whatever has not been accounted for in the beginning of the meal. So the best thing would be to go back and recalculate that meal and think, should I have added more for protein, for fat? Did I really calculate the portion size correctly? So it's not because my insulin is works shorter than for others. So make sure you would remember that, because that's important. Otherwise, if you not accounted for, as in the right side of the graph, if you do not account for this active insulin by artificially shortening your bolus or bolus on board or duration of insulin action, then you go into bed with all this extra insulin that is still active, and you're at risk for going to get low blood sugar. So it's also important to know approximately the basal bolus balance for the body. So usually for children or prior to puberty, the kids are always active, running around, and like to eat high carb meals. Therefore, we need to leave the room to bolus for those carbohydrates or to inject for those carbohydrates. Therefore, the basal insulin would only be about 30 to 45% of the total daily dose. For puberty, their hormones are up. So the hormones are up that raise the blood sugar. So therefore, the basal insulin increases to about, the needs increase to about 40 to 55%. And for average adult, it would be about 45 to 50%, 60% sometimes maybe for someone who is more sedentary and who is eating more of the higher fat meals overall. So this would be about 45 to 60%. And for thin elderly individuals, again, the basal dose percentage goes down to about 40 to 50%. So check for correction bolus on your download. So it's very useful to, and we can do maybe one of the sessions to how to interpret your downloads. So look at the percentage of the corrective boluses. So if your percentage of the corrective boluses is over 8 to 9%, then something needs to be adjusted. So it may be carb ratio, it may be basal dose, but something is not right because you have the need to correct. So you're trying to do the retrospective. So you're patching again to whatever should have been done probably from the beginning. So it would be analyzing the data, going back and adjusting the settings. Okay. So there used to be a concept of super bolus. It's a little bit more difficult to use this super bolus for with the smart pumps, but again, you can still use it. So what the principle of that is, you give yourself more insulin intentionally for the beginning of the meal, before the meal. So you're kind of shifting your part of your basal to the bolus to cover the spike. But then you're lowering your basal to make sure you're not going low. Again, this is not easy to do without the insulin pump. So this is more for the insulin pump users. So the recommendations from the specialists, from the consensus recommendations are that what super bolus, it would be used for someone who is eating the meal that is the carbohydrates about quarter of your weight or in pounds or higher. For example, if your weight is 160 pounds, so if you're eating more than 40 grams of carbs, then you really need to give maybe a little bit more insulin for the bolus and then reduce the basal rates at the same time. For the smart pumps, there are some tricks that can be done, but it will be, so we can discuss that if we have time, but this would be a different discussion for each pump because there is a different calculation of the algorithm in each pump. All right.
There's other options, like for example, inhalable insulin that I know Dr. Basina sometimes utilizes, and maybe she can also talk about this, but when we're thinking about pre-bolusing, things that are inhalable insulin, they work pretty much right away. So those are the instances that you wouldn't really want to pre-bolus. So we're talking about insulins that you're putting inside of your pump, those fast-acting insulins. And I actually can see the chat now, and I think someone had mentioned when we were talking about pre-bolusing that whenever they pre-bolus, their blood sugar always kind of crashes. So another thing that we have not addressed in this presentation, because we're mostly talking more about the food, pre-bolusing, if you've been exercising, your body is more sensitive to the insulin that you're putting in your body. And so things around exercise, that might be a time when you also want to think about maybe not pre-bolusing or factoring in what you're eating. So maybe looking at that as another way. Dr. Basina, did you want to do this one, or do you want me to?
It's up to you. I can either or.
Okay, I can start.
Okay.
Okay, so thinking about extending your bolus, so I know the dual wave is more related to Medtronic, but extending your bolus if you're wearing a pump, you want to think about there are different reasons maybe why you'd want to do that. So extending your bolus over time, maybe you have something called gastroparesis. So your digestive tract, it moves slower. So your foods that you're eating, it might not follow that normal trend that Dr. Basina had mentioned, different foods absorb in. It might be even slower than that. Something like if you go to a buffet and you're going to graze over a long period of time, or you're at a party or you're snacking, that might be another reason why you want to bolus over time. Or extending your bolus if you have a high-fat, high-protein meal, giving 50% up front and 50% at 2 hours can help you so you don't go low, but you also meet the needs as your blood sugar rises more in the 2 to 3 hour range.
All right, so again, as I mentioned earlier, that injection sites is #1 key for success. So it's very important to examine and to review the sites where you're injecting the insulin. So there's a term that we use a lot for individuals who are on insulin injection. This term caused lipohypertrophy. So as you can see on these pictures, there's a little like bulges of the fat tissue. So insulin is the hormone, and it does promote the cell's growth when you inject it into the body. So if you inject into the same site, this is what can happen. So those little fat pads that develop, and patients love injecting in those fat pads because there's no longer pain in those fat pads. But this is the false reassurance that you're doing great using those sites, because it's actually affecting a large number of patients. Per the studies, it's affecting up to 70% of the patients, and that cause erratic insulin absorption. So that causes a lot of glycemic variability. So a lot of the times, I'm sure you all experience that you would say, I did exactly the same thing today as I did yesterday. Yesterday, my blood sugars were perfect, but today I'm just staying high and cannot bring them down. So this would be one of the reasons, possible reasons. So look at the sites where exactly you're placing the insulin injection or insulin infusion set for the pump. So it had been shown that reduction of the absorption from the site can be as much as 25% or even more. So I had patients who had been injecting into those very hypertrophied sites, and when we changed to different sites, the amount of insulin reduced by more than 50% actually. So, but be careful when you do it, because switching to different sites, if you were injecting in those hypertrophy sites, can cause hypoglycemia, because now if you're using the sites where you have not injected before, and if you are taking the same amount of insulin, that can cause low blood sugars. So what are the risk factors for developing of this lipohypertrophy? So improper site rotation. So it's very, very important to rotate the sites. And rotating the sites usually doesn't mean injecting right or left, but it's using all possible sites you can. So the whole abdomen, the upper buttock, the flanks, the sides, the upper hips, or the outer part of the hips, and the upper legs to the back of the legs. Another very important another very important point is the reuse of the needles. I know we're all trying to save the supplies, and a lot of people will reuse the needles, and some people will reuse the same needle for a week or until it gets dull and doesn't get into the body anymore. But this, for all the studies, have been shown to be one of the most important factors for the development of those hypertrophy sites. And the hypothesized reason for that is that there are blood products on that needle. So when you are placing the same needle into the body, you are introducing those blood products back in, and that's create inflammation reaction in the body that tends to form the scar tissue. Okay, next please.
Dr. Bassina, someone had asked in, what would you suggest for pregnant women as far as other options for sites?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So usually for the first half of the pregnancy or for the first and second trimester, it's totally fine to use the abdomen. So again, use the small needle. Our thickness of the skin is about 3 millimeters. So if you use the 4 millimeter needle, which are the nano needle or the I think they call ultra fine, small ultra short needle with 4 millimeter length. So you're barely getting underneath the skin. So you're not getting anywhere deep to harm the baby or to get to the uterus. So you're not getting any close to that. So it's totally fine to use the abdomen. But as the skin stretches in the third trimester, then move to the sides, move to the flank of the body, move to the upper buttock, move to the outer thighs. Or the arms. So those would be the areas for injection, or for the sites for the insulin pump. All right, other practical tips that avoid the post-meal corrections. So when you do the post-meal corrections, every pump will calculate differently of how much active insulin stays in the body. So some pumps will account some of the carbohydrates that you covered with the meal, but some pumps would not account for this. So it would not account any insulin left from the carbohydrates coverage from the meal prior. So let's say if you had a big meal for dinner, and then you decided 2 hours later, you decided that everyone is eating this amazing ice cream and you want to eat this ice cream as well. So it's okay to do it and cover it, but if you do it, you would subtract some of the active insulin that you already have. So it's all the pumps. You can look up at how much active insulin is there. And what we usually say, leave half of that active to cover the food, and subtract 50 to 30% of that active insulin. As an example, if you still have 4 units of active insulin, you would think of subtracting 1 or 2. So you would count as 2 active. So if you need another 4 units to cover that ice cream, you would only take 2 or 3 units, but not the full 4. Again, Leah talked a lot about the conversion of the protein to the glucose. So protein breaks down to amino acids, and those amino acids travel to the liver, and liver make the glucose out of it. But this whole process can take about 6 to 8 hours. So again, especially if it's an animal protein that is slowly to digest. So again, enter the 50% of your gram of protein to the carb count. For example, if you're eating a chicken breast, and I think Leah gave examples and we'll do more, then you would, out of 20 grams of protein, you would add 10 grams of carbohydrates to your carb count. Now, the recommendations are from the specialists. If the grams of protein in the meal exceeds 1/6 of the weight in pounds, and again, I'm not sure, you don't need to exactly remember all those numbers, then cover those grams, cover for the carbohydrate, cover as for half of the carbohydrates. There are different formulas, and I think you will get the slides. I don't want to you to memorize it, but it's Warsaw formula that was published, and it's called fat protein units. So you would use fat per grams of protein, and if the total calories equals 100 or more, then you would add a unit of insulin for that. But again, use that as a sort of the recommendation, but it would work differently, unfortunately, for everyone. And we already discussed about 30 to 40 grams of fat to add 30 to 35% of the insulin to the bolus and use an extended bolus, and you can split over 2 to 4 hours. Some patients say that some individuals really do extend pizza for 6 hours and it works for them. So unfortunately, a lot of that is trial and error to try different things. If you're eating less than 20 grams of protein, if it's less than 10 or 15, then I wouldn't worry. Then I wouldn't add, like Leah said, you don't have to add that. But if you're eating 20, 25, which is close to 30, you don't have to add the whole 30, 35%. You can add 15 to 20%. And again, if on injections, then split the bolus and give some before and some after. Okay. Next.
Dr. Basina, I think 2 other people had questions, and their questions are around how fast does it take to heal the lipodystrophy?
So yeah, that's a great question. So unfortunately, I wish I would have different answer for you, but it will take years for it to heal. Now, how you can use up those sites. You don't have to waste those sites. You can still use them. So we did the study here at Stanford, and it showed that if you use your sensor, because with the sensor, with the, you're not infusing anything, so you can actually use the sensor in those sites. So you can save the sites, the other sites where you would have placed the sensor, you can save those for infusion sets. So we showed that the infusion sets, when used into those hypertrophy sites or the scar tissue sites, actually improves the performance of the sensor. Okay. So I'm sure you've seen, Leah, do you want to take where? So I'm sure you had seen those in your own tracing and or on your children or your significant others. So let's say you had your meal here on Wednesday, the 23rd, and your meal consisted of lamb chop plus fried rice plus avocado in their salad with olive oil and some other portions of fats. So you gave yourself some insulin, you were great, and then started rising and kept rising and stayed up until you were in the middle of the night. And then it all came down and you didn't feel good early in the morning at 3 a.m. because blood sugars dropped, and you woke up and you had some correction, which brought the blood sugars up again. So again, the same concept of the slow absorption of the fat and extending the bolus. So if you can give yourself on a 23rd, just very smaller amount for that particular meal, it could have been just 30–40% of the bolus to give an upfront, especially if your blood sugar was already on the low side to begin with. And then the rest extend over. Again, this was a fatty meal, so I probably would do 3 to 4 hours, and this one.
Are you guys ready for some more polls? Okay, so I have a couple more poll questions. We have it for you. So let me access the polls. So looking at where this dark square, the black square is, looking at that lunchtime meal, maybe an early lunch, what do you think this person could have done to avoid that blood sugar spike? Okay, just a couple more seconds. Okay, I'm going to end the polling and share those results. Okay, so 92% of you said pre-bolus. So yes, definitely. In this instance, with that really sharp curve, that person could have pre-bolus to help kind of smooth out that, that curve, see how it kind of went up and down. So giving a pre-bolus, maybe 15 or 30 minutes before eating could have helped. Bolusing after a meal. So someone said bolusing after a meal. So when you bolus after a meal, it actually offsets that insulin use and absorption even later. So the blood sugar probably would have come up even a little higher before the insulin started working. And then 5% said not sure, 2 people, but the majority of you definitely said pre-bolus. So this might be something that you can consider trying in your daily life if you're not pre-bolusing right now, and experiment and see how it goes. If you can kind of smooth out some of those curves for yourself. Okay, so we have another poll. Okay, what about this graph? So what do you think this person should have done in that later time at night, like 6 or 7 p.m.? And I know that with this picture, you're only getting 1 day and 1 night till midnight, but the blood sugar stayed around that range till early in the morning. Okay, I'll give you maybe a couple more seconds and then I'll stop the poll. Okay, so the majority, 74% of you said extend that bolus. So excellent, so extending that bolus. Some people said give more, so you might also have needed to give more. That could have been an answer too. Bolus after dinner. So I wouldn't say bolusing after dinner because if you see the rise, it's more around extending your bolus. So giving some bolus, some insulin up front, and then some insulin later to meet the needs. Because I know I'm not giving you the example of what this person ate, but it was probably a higher fat, higher protein dinner with some carbs. And then the last one that we have . Okay, what would you do for this graph? So the top one is Saturday and the bottom one is Sunday. It's a multiple choice question, so you can answer multiple if you want. But see, what do you think for this one? Looking at that larger spike. Sorry, around like 6 o'clock. Oh, I didn't put little black boxes. Okay, I'm gonna end this polling too. Oh, a lot more people, wow. I said I was gonna end it and I think like 6 more people weighed in. Okay, so I'm gonna end the poll and share these results. So a lot of you said pre-bolus, which is excellent, like Dr. Basina was talking about and I was talking about, which would be a great thing because look at that steep curve for that dinner. Some people said extend your bolus 50% over those 2 hours. So when we look at this, and maybe Dr. Basina also wants to pop in and mention, but when we look at how this patient's blood sugar went down, maybe around like 3 or 4 hours after eating, if we extended this bolus, they would be getting more of that insulin when the blood sugars were already low or in the hypoglycemia range because they would have extended it. So in this one case, because it's such a high up and down, I know we didn't give you the example of what the food was, but I would say this meal is probably something that's heavier in rice or pasta. So this would be more of a pre-meal bolus. Some people said give more insulin. You could have, but then the blood sugar did end up going lower. It seems more like a pre-bolus situation that we would recommend. Dr. Basina, did you want to mention anything as well?
I think usually we always say what's very helpful for, especially if you do wear a continuous glucose monitoring device, so look at it more frequently. And if you see the rise pretty quickly, then you probably just go back and think, did I really estimate my carbs and did I really take the full bolus? So don't wait till you're peaked for the blood sugar. because if you take your corrective dose at the peak, you can see how steeply the blood sugar is coming down. So you would be at a risk for having very low blood sugar after that, when this insulin that you injected peaks plus your extra correction. So always remember that whatever you take now will peak in about an hour and a half to 2 hours, and at that time food could be gone. So pay attention to the arrows on your CGM. Those are super, super helpful. So again, if you're bolus for the beginning of the meal, and if you are seeing that the blood sugar starts spiking, give yourself a little bit more right away. So don't wait till it spikes. So that's always helpful, because before you get to the peak, that insulin will help. Leah, there was a question in the chart. If you eat a lot of beans or lentils, do you add protein for that from beans or lentils? If you eat
Yeah, that's a great question. So for beans and lentils, they do have protein, but I would not add protein because like we were discussing earlier, more higher levels, maybe like 20 or 30 grams of protein is when we would really start considering halving that protein and giving it the bolus. And so when we think about beans and lentils, they're a lot lower than that higher level of protein. So you get protein foods like that more from like meat and sometimes from like higher like Greek yogurt, yogurt that's been strained and there's more of the protein part, but less from lentils. So for the lentils, I focus more on the carb count for those, because even though we consider them proteins as well, especially if someone's eating a vegetarian diet, they are predominantly still carbohydrate. Like if you look at the breakdown of lentil, they're mostly carbohydrate.
Great. One more great question in the chat. So now the protein powders are very popular, so to be added to the smoothies. So if protein powder that has just high protein and no carbohydrates added to the smoothie, and it's a blend of wheat and pea protein, do you cover for that?
So just the protein and not a lot of fruit, I would cover, like if you're doing, most of the protein powders have 20 to 25 grams of protein per scoop. I would say really try to carb count that correctly. If you're always high, you could maybe add some for protein, but I would say really try to nail down the carb count on that, just because it's a liquid and it's not going to be slowed down as well as a liquid protein as a powder, because it's more processed. And I would definitely pre-bolus that. But you can experiment. For example, if you're always high and you feel like you need to add, like say you do 2 scoops of protein powder, so you have 40 grams or 50 grams of protein, you can consider adding some for that protein. But I would first experiment with just really nailing down and measuring that carb count first.
To summarize, what we have learned today is that avoid the need for postprandial corrections. Try as much as you can to do the pre-correction to pre-bolus or pre-injection if you can. Again, it's not 100% possible in different circumstances, but use 50 grams of protein as converted to glucose over the next 6 to 8 hours and add to the carb count. If the meal is very high in fat, over 30 to 40 grams, then consider increasing insulin dose by 30 to 35% and use as an extended bolus. You can do 50-50% or different split that you can try. If under injections, then take about the third of that amount of insulin 1 hour after the meal. And when grams of protein are more than 1/6 of the weight in pounds, then cover, again, add those carbohydrates. And a lot of information is a great resource. It's diabetesnet.com. There are a lot of presentations from Dr. Bruce Bode, Dr. Earl Hirsch. You can look at their slides as well. I think that's a great, I really like that website. And again, we always do constant problem solving. That's our life, right? So when you are having a little bit of the spike or some spike, and I know it's frustrating, but don't get frustrated. No one is perfect in life. So, but just think about it. Why did that happen? How could I possibly made it better so I can use it for next time? Don't concentrate on, oh, it's horrible, my blood sugar is high now, so that's okay. This is what can happen. And believe it or not, someone who does not have diabetes, we can also go to 200 blood sugar. So don't punish yourself and don't think that you did something bad. Just look at it as your future direction. What can I do next time to make it better? And analyzing it, and what should I do next time? And we can open to more questions. I don't know if you have more of the slides for, yeah, Leah.
I think we just have like one or two more slides. So a couple questions that I see is subtracting soluble and insoluble fiber. So when it says total fiber, that accounts for soluble and insoluble. So don't double count the fiber. And then someone also mentioned that the questions we asked do kind of think about people who are on pumps more. But if you're on MDI or multiple daily injections, you can always kind of manually do that. So give 50% up front and then 50% later if you want to extend your bolus at 2 hours. So that's a way if you don't mind giving multiple injections. So some of our take-home messages are just really experiment. So like Dr. Bassina had mentioned, everybody is different, everybody's body is different, and what works for them is different. Your activity level, and there's just so many variables when managing your blood sugar and trying to be your own body's pancreas. So many variables, and it's challenging. Not every day looks the same, and even if it did, your blood sugars would not react the same every day, unfortunately. So just use some of these tips maybe as experiments. If there's a meal you always eat, maybe burger and fries at night, and you're always high, you always wake up high, consider adding that fat. Thinking about trying one meal maybe at a dinner time or a lunch time and trying to experiment and see if this really helps. Because that dinner time will make more of an impact over your A1C, because if you can sort of get your blood sugars to a level that you want overnight, it lowers your A1C. And then we just have this, the last poll, and we just want to see how much insulin you would give if you're Lucy. It's the exact same question. Okay. I know these questions are a little bit harder because they have to do with a lot more math that you're either doing in your head, or if you're wearing a pump, your pump can help you do that too. Okay, I'm going to end this poll. Share the results. So most of you gave 5 units, which is more than what people had given in the beginning for this higher fat meal. So 13% said 4, 48% said 5, 6 units was 22, 7 units 13%, and then 9 units was 4. And so this is just a kind of a brief slide that you guys can have too when we're done. And this is our last slide, but this is the breakdown of the carbs and the fat from that meal. And then just kind of looking at how it was calculated. So because the fat grams were was higher, we added 35% to the total. So it was around 7 units to give for that meal. And then finally, we just really wanted to say thank you all for joining us. I know that we talked a lot about carbs and fats and proteins and threw a lot of information at you. This has been recorded, so you can go back and review it and look at the PowerPoint if you want. And then, yeah, we're happy to answer questions. And we definitely want to say thank you to the Health Library at Stanford, JDRF, Stanford Diabetes Research Center, and then our diabetes care team. To say thank you.
Great. Leah, the question in the chat, which is great. What are the recommendations of having protein shake post-exercise? Since post-exercise, you may have increased insulin sensitivity. Should you avoid pre-bolusing for protein at that time, or do you recommend reduced bolus?
Yeah, so for protein shakes post-exercise, I would say you do not want to consider adding extra insulin for your protein shake, because you're completely right. You're very sensitive to your insulin and you're at a very high risk of having hypoglycemia. So I would not cover that protein. This is more like if you're thinking about eating solid foods like at a meal, like a steak or a burger and fries, that would be a good place to start with adding in for protein and fat, rather than starting with a protein shake, because those ones are a little bit more, could be a little bit more challenging. Good question. Dr. Bassina, someone was asking, is there a way to actually test what my absorption rate is?
Yeah, there's no great way to test it in the practice. So there are ways to test it in the research, and that's how those pharmacodynamic and pharmacokinetic studies were done. But in practice, just to test the absorption would be more of either you're to test your basal rates if you are on the pump, which will be not eating the food if your blood sugar is staying steady, and just watching your blood sugar with the insulin, with the continuous glucose monitoring device. If you want to assess the post-meal absorption, again, it's you can try to use some pre-packaged, like frozen dinner type of meals, and then watch how your absorption of that insulin is. But again, unfortunately, as we discussed, there's so many variables for that absorption that it could be, even if you test it now, it could be different when you test it tomorrow, because your stress level could be different. Your blood sugar before that meal could have been different. Your food absorption rate or emptying of the stomach could have been different. So you're all trying to do your really great and best to estimate it. But unfortunately, those are, we usually call them educated guesses.
And then someone's asking for that he would prefer a multiplier for protein and fat to correct for an underestimated bolus. Why don't we go that way? Grams times X equals added dose. It would be simpler. I think when we think about that question, and maybe Dr. Bassina wants to answer it too, we for an underdose, we want to think about going back and really focusing on that carb count, because this webinar that we did was kind of a high level on if you're carb counting right now, these are other ways to optimize your blood sugars. But number one is always really dialing in your carb count. And if you're not as confident with your carb count, then that's where you want to focus on first, number one. And this is kind of your number two or number three. Dr. Bassina, do you have anything to add?
Not much to that. I think you already addressed that. Yeah, I think it's. Yeah. So there's a question about the glucose variability for standard deviation and the personal glucose levels. I assume this is for the question about entering the settings into the pump. I'm not sure exactly what the question about those is, but when you look at your glucose reports, usually for standard deviation or coefficient of variation in the reports, we'll estimate those as the markers or the estimation of the glucose variability. And we aim for coefficient variation to be less than 30%, and for standard deviation, ideally to be less than 30% of the mean. But definitely at least shouldn't be more than 50% of the mean. Sorry, I'm not sure if I answered your question. And there is one raised hand, Leah, so I'm not sure how do we look at that. Do you know how to do that? Yeah, so there's a comment about the variation in the blood sugar depending on the macronutrient in the meal. So yes, definitely every day will be somewhat different.
Great. And if you had a question and you're raising your hand, maybe just type it into the chat. But I do think that maybe we have answered all of the questions for now. That I can see. If anyone has any lasting questions, feel free to ask them now. If not, then we'll end this and stop the recording and hope everyone has a great night. I don't think there's any more questions. Thank you all for spending so much time on a Thursday. We really appreciate it. So thank you.
Very much. Thanks a lot. There is if Stephanie from JDRF, if you're still online, there is a question about if the presentation would be posted on JDRF site. So we can ask Stephanie and maybe reply to participants. I don't know if Anna can do it or Ronald can do it afterwards.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, perfect. Hi, everyone. We will be putting it on the JDRF Greater Bay Area YouTube page, and I'll send out the link and we'll get everyone that access.
Great. Thank you, Stephanie. All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Everyone. Thank you for participating.